My name is Ethan Rowe. I am writing this because the version that exists in the official incident report is incomplete in a way that feels intentional. It reduces several hours of sustained disorientation, fear, and contradiction into a handful of neutral sentences about equipment malfunction and navigational error. That explanation does not account for the patterns I observed, or why I still find myself waking in the early morning hours listening for footsteps that stop the moment I become aware of them. I was assigned as a seasonal wilderness ranger to a protected forest zone that sat well beyond the range of normal visitor activity. It was an area with no campgrounds, no viewpoints, and no maintained trails listed on public maps. Internally, it was still marked as an active boundary corridor, which meant it required periodic foot patrols to ensure that markers remained intact and that no unauthorized entry had occurred. On paper, it was considered low risk. In practice, it was simply ignored. During my briefing, my supervisor handed me a folded topographic map and tapped a faint line running near the outer edge of the preserve. He told me the trail existed only because it had never fully disappeared. He emphasized that I should follow it as closely as possible and that if I encountered any missing boundary markers, I was to replace them immediately. He did not explain why that task mattered more than any of the others. I began the patrol shortly after sunrise. The forest was quiet, not in a peaceful way, but in a restrained one, as if sound itself was being absorbed before it could travel very far. The air was cool and dry. My boots followed a shallow depression in the ground that suggested a trail more by habit than by maintenance. Every few hundred yards, I encountered aluminum boundary markers nailed into trees, each stamped with a faded identification number. Most were weathered but intact. A few were missing entirely, leaving only pale scars in the bark. The first missing marker I replaced without incident. I logged the coordinates, photographed the installation, and continued forward. Less than an hour later, I encountered the same marker again. At the time, I assumed I had made a simple mistake. The forest can be repetitive, especially when you are new to an area. I checked my GPS, adjusted my heading slightly, and continued walking. When I encountered the marker a third time, I stopped. The number stamped into the aluminum was identical. The scratches along its surface were the same. Even the slight rusting around the nail head matched perfectly. The tree itself was different, and the surrounding terrain was not an exact match, but the marker was unmistakable. I checked my GPS again. The coordinates were different, separated by enough distance that this should not have been possible. I told myself that fatigue and unfamiliarity were influencing my perception. I kept walking. By midday, I had logged 12 boundary markers bearing the same identification number. Each time, the surrounding environment shifted subtly. The slope of the ground changed. The density of the underbrush varied. But the marker itself never did. The repetition began to feel deliberate, like a pattern I was not meant to recognize too quickly. I radioed this in. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough for me to check the signal strength twice. When my supervisor responded, his tone was calm but noticeably controlled. He told me to complete the patrol and return before dark. He did not ask for clarification. He did not ask for photos. He did not sound surprised. That was the first moment I felt something was wrong. As the afternoon progressed, the forest itself seemed to lose cohesion. Bird calls repeated in intervals that felt too precise. Wind moved through the canopy in segmented waves, as if passing over invisible boundaries. At one point, I became aware of footsteps behind me. They were slow and evenly spaced, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped walking, they stopped. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Near the far end of the patrol route, according to the map, there should have been a clearing where an old ranger outpost once stood. I found the clearing. There was no sign of any structure. No foundation stones. No debris. Just flat ground and a single boundary marker nailed into a dead tree at the center. The number on this marker was different. The sense of relief I felt was immediate and unexpected. I logged the marker, took a photograph, and sat down to drink some water. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were human boot prints, dozens of them, overlapping and circling the clearing. All were the same size, all faced inward. None led away. My radio crackled abruptly, loud enough to make me flinch. When I answered, my supervisor's voice came through distorted, as if the signal were traveling through something denser than air. He told me to listen carefully. He said that if I found myself in a marked loop, I needed to stop moving forward. He said that forward did not mean what I thought it meant out there. He instructed me to retrace my steps exactly, marker by marker, without deviating even slightly. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. He told me not to follow anyone who looked like me. Before I could ask what that meant, the transmission cut out. The light in the forest shifted as the sun lowered, and with it, my sense of distance changed. Trees that had once seemed evenly spaced now felt crowded. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the trail. I turned back the way I had come, forcing myself to walk slowly and evenly, counting my steps between markers. At the first marker, I hesitated. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt. They were mine. I recognized the wear pattern immediately. They were heading in the opposite direction. I scanned the trail ahead. The forest was empty, but somewhere deeper among the trees, I heard movement again. Footsteps, slow and patient, moving away from me just beyond sight. I stayed where I was longer than felt reasonable, breathing shallowly, weighing whether following my own trail was safer than continuing alone. Eventually, I chose to keep going back, trusting the map, trusting my count. The markers continued. Same number, same scratches, same rust, over and over again. The sky darkened faster than it should have. My GPS battery drained without warning. When I finally reached what should have been the trailhead, I found only another clearing. This one was smaller. The ground was undisturbed except for a single set of footprints standing at the center, facing me. They did not move. I turned off my headlamp and stood completely still. Somewhere nearby, a radio clicked on. It was not mine. The voice that came through sounded exactly like me, calling my name, telling me it had found the way out, urging me to hurry before it got dark. I did not answer. I waited. When my supervisor's voice finally came through my own radio again, faint but real, he asked me one question before the signal died. He asked me if I was sure I was still the one holding the radio. I did not answer my supervisor's question. I kept the radio close to my chest and waited, listening to the static thin out until the channel went completely dead. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced so far, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath during the transmission and was now free to exhale again. I stood there longer than was practical. I knew that darkness had fully settled in, and without my headlamp, the clearing dissolved into a flat absence of detail. I could not see the footprints anymore, but I knew exactly where they were. I could feel them, fixed in place, facing me. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I turned the headlamp back on, keeping the beam low and narrow, and stepped around the footprints rather than toward them. My supervisor's words repeated in my head, slow and deliberate. Do not move forward. Retrace exactly. Do not follow anyone who looks like you. I focused on the boundary markers. They were the only constant left. The first marker appeared sooner than it should have. I logged it without stopping, checking the number, confirming the scratches, confirming the rust. Everything matched. I moved to the next, and the next. My breathing stayed controlled, but my hands had started to shake enough that I had to grip the radio tightly to steady them. Somewhere behind me, something stepped on a branch. The sound was close, too close to be an echo or an animal passing through. I did not turn around. I adjusted my pace instead, slowing slightly, then speeding up again, testing whether the sound would follow. It did. Always the same distance. Always the same rhythm. I remembered what my supervisor had said about forward not meaning what I thought it meant. I tried not to think about how that applied to direction. I kept my eyes on the markers and counted my steps between them, anchoring myself to numbers and routine. At one point, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no wind. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, like they were being absorbed before they could travel. The pressure in my ears built slowly, the way it does before a storm, but the sky above the canopy remained clear and starless. I reached another clearing. This one was wrong immediately. The shape was irregular, and the ground sloped inward toward the center. There were no footprints, but there was a boundary marker standing upright in the dirt, not nailed to anything. It was identical to the others. Same number, same where. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. The radio in my hand clicked once, sharply, like a mic being keyed and released. I did not touch it. A voice came through anyway. It was mine again, closer now, no longer calling my name but speaking in the flat, focused tone I used when logging data. It was describing the marker in the clearing, reading off details I had already observed, as if narrating my actions just a few seconds ahead of time. I backed away slowly, careful not to turn my back on the clearing. The voice continued, adjusting as I moved, describing my hesitation, my breathing, my position relative to the marker. It did not sound mocking. It sounded efficient. When I reached the tree line again, the voice stopped. The forest noise returned all at once. Wind rushed through the canopy. Insects resumed their calls. I stood there shaking, trying to understand how any of this could be explained as stress or misinterpretation. I did not encounter another clearing after that. The trail narrowed, then widened again, then narrowed once more. The boundary markers continued at regular intervals, always the same. I kept walking, convinced that stopping would only make it easier for whatever was following me to close the distance. Eventually, I noticed something new. There were two sets of boot prints now. One set was mine. The other matched perfectly. Same size, same tread pattern. They overlapped in places, diverged in others, but always stayed close. Too close. I realized then that the footsteps I had been hearing were not behind me. They were beside me. The understanding came with a physical reaction. My stomach dropped, and my vision blurred at the edges. I kept walking anyway, eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge what that implied. The prints did not always appear in my headlamp beam, but I knew they were there. I could feel them pacing me, matching my speed exactly. My radio crackled again, and this time I answered immediately, afraid of what would happen if I did not. My supervisor's voice came through clear but low. He told me not to stop. He told me that if I reached a marker that was not nailed down, I needed to destroy it. He said that was important. When I asked him why, he hesitated. He said that the markers were not just for people like me. Before I could ask anything else, the transmission cut out. I kept moving. My legs burned from the constant tension, from never fully relaxing my stride. When I encountered the next loose marker, I did not hesitate. I pulled it from the ground and bent it until the aluminum creased sharply. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Somewhere nearby, something exhaled slowly, like air being released from a confined space. The second set of footprints disappeared. I did not feel relief. I felt exposed. The forest seemed to press closer after that, the darkness thickening between the trees. My headlamp began to flicker, not dying completely, just dimming enough to make every shadow uncertain. I counted markers obsessively, afraid of missing one, afraid of finding one too many. When I finally saw the faint outline of the trailhead sign ahead, I almost collapsed from the surge of relief. The sign was old and weathered, but unmistakable. Beyond it lay the service road. Beyond that, the ranger station. I crossed the boundary line and did not stop walking until my boots hit gravel. Only then did I turn around. The forest behind me looked normal, quiet, empty. There were no footprints crossing the boundary, no loose markers, nothing out of place. My radio clicked one last time. My supervisor's voice came through softly. He told me to sit down and wait. He told me help was on the way. Then he asked me very carefully if I had destroyed every marker that was not where it belonged. I told him yes. There was a pause. Then he said that was good because someone had been calling in on my frequency for the last hour, insisting they were me, insisting they had made it out, and asking why no one was answering. I sat on the gravel until the headlights arrived, listening to the forest behind me, trying not to think about how close I had come to following the wrong set of footprints. I stayed seated on the gravel until the truck came to a full stop in front of me. The headlights washed over my boots, my legs, my hands still clenched around the radio. I remember thinking, with a strange sense of detachment, that I should probably stand up and identify myself, but the idea of moving before someone said my name felt unsafe in a way I couldn't explain. 2 rangers stepped out. I recognized both of them. They did not approach right away. They stood by the truck, scanning the tree line behind me, their flashlights moving slowly, methodically, as if they were checking for something they expected to see. Only when one of them said my name did I finally stand. They brought me back to the station without conversation. The drive was short, but every shadow beyond the headlights felt dense, layered, like something could be standing just out of reach of the light. I kept my eyes forward and my radio off. No one asked me to turn it in. Inside the station, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The walls were bare except for maps and incident charts. The normalcy of it felt artificial, like a set built to resemble safety rather than the thing itself. They sat me at a metal table and handed me water. I drank it without tasting it. My supervisor arrived last. He looked exhausted, older than he had that morning. He did not ask me to recount the patrol. Instead, he asked me a series of very specific questions. Did I ever step off the trail intentionally? Did I encounter any markers that were not affixed to trees? Did I hear any radio traffic that did not originate from him or dispatch? Each time, he waited for my answer before moving on, watching my face closely. When he was satisfied, he finally asked me the question I had been waiting for. He asked me if I ever saw myself. I told him no, that I only heard the voice, that I saw the footprints but never the person making them. He nodded, as if that confirmed something rather than ruled it out. He explained carefully that the boundary corridor I had been assigned to was not just a geographic perimeter. It was an operational one. Certain sections of the forest had a documented history of disorientation events that could not be attributed solely to terrain, weather, or human error. People entered those sections and failed to exit in predictable ways. Sometimes they vanished entirely. Sometimes they came back changed in subtle but consistent patterns. The markers, he said, were not there to keep people out. They were there to keep something contained. He told me that the identification numbers were not unique by mistake. Repetition was intentional. The markers acted as reference points, not for navigation, but for continuity. They established what belonged where. When one was removed or displaced, the boundary weakened. When too many were missing, things that were supposed to remain localized began to loop, overlap, and mimic. I asked him why I had been sent in alone. He met my eyes and did not look away when he said that new rangers were less recognizable to whatever was operating out there. Familiarity made things worse. I stayed at the station overnight. They did not let me sleep. Every few hours, someone checked my pupils, my coordination, my responses. They asked me to repeat details of the patrol in different orders, looking for inconsistencies. I answered everything honestly. I did not tell them about the moment, just before the headlights appeared, when I had felt an overwhelming certainty that if I turned around too soon, I would see someone standing exactly where I had just been. In the morning, they drove me home. I was placed on administrative leave pending review. The official report cited navigational confusion caused by outdated maps and equipment malfunction. My GPS unit was confiscated. My radio was replaced. The patrol route was quietly removed from the rotation. I tried to return to normal life. For a while, it almost worked. Then the calls started. At first, they came in as missed calls from numbers that did not exist when I tried to call back. Then voicemails began to appear, all silent except for background noise that sounded faintly like wind through trees. One night, I answered by mistake. The voice on the line was calm, familiar, thanked me for leaving the markers intact. It said that made things easier. I changed my number after that. I moved out of my apartment when I began finding mud on my floor that did not match my boots. I stopped hiking entirely. Still, sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel that same pressure in my ears, that sense of being paced rather than followed. Last week, my supervisor contacted me for the first time since the incident. He asked me if I still had the radio they issued me after the patrol. I told him I did. He asked me to check the battery compartment. Inside, taped beneath the casing, was a small folded slip of paper I had never seen before. On it was a boundary marker number, the same one I had logged over and over again in the forest. My supervisor told me they had lost contact with a ranger on a different corridor 2 days ago. He said the markers there had started repeating. Before he ended the call, he asked me one last thing. He asked me if I was absolutely certain that the voice I heard in the forest had been copying me. Because sometimes, he said, it was the other way around. I told my supervisor I needed time. That was not entirely true. What I needed was distance, and there was no amount that felt sufficient anymore. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with the radio resting in front of me, untouched. The apartment was quiet in the normal way, refrigerator humming, pipes ticking faintly in the walls, but underneath that was a sense of alignment I could not shake, as if everything in the room had been arranged to match something elsewhere. I did not open the radio. I did not remove the battery. I left it exactly where it was. That night, I slept on the couch with the lights on. I dreamed of walking a straight trail that never changed, each step landing exactly where it had before. When I woke just before dawn, my ears felt full, the pressure familiar enough now that I recognized it immediately. I stayed still and waited for it to pass. Didn't. The radio clicked on by itself. There was no voice at first, just the faint hiss of an open channel. I reached for it, then stopped, remembering every instruction I had been given about not responding too quickly, about waiting to be addressed directly. The hiss shifted, resolving into something patterned. Breathing, controlled, measured. Then my supervisor's voice came through, quiet and strained. He asked me where I was. I told him I was at home. He asked me to describe the room around me. I did. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he told me that the missing ranger had been found. Alive. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. He said the ranger had walked out onto a service road just before midnight, barefoot, dehydrated, and completely convinced he had been gone for less than an hour. He had been missing for 2 days. When asked where he had been, he described a patrol identical to mine, down to the repeated marker number and the voice on the radio. The only difference was that he claimed he had followed it. I asked my supervisor what happened to people who followed it. He did not answer immediately. When he did speak, he said that the forest did not create copies. It created continuity. The problem, he said, was determining which version that continuity favored. He told me they needed my help. I said no. That should have been the end of it. Instead, he asked me to look out my window. Across the street, at the edge of the small tree line separating my building from the access road, there was a figure standing motionless between the trunks. Even at that distance, I recognized the posture, the slight forward lean, the way the shoulders sat. It wasn't close enough for details, but it didn't need to be. I closed the blinds slowly. My supervisor's voice remained calm. He said that whatever had crossed the boundary corridor did not always stay there. He said that the markers defined more than just space. They defined permission. When enough of them were disturbed, the distinction between inside and outside weakened. He asked me if I still knew how to place one. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at the station. The drive felt longer than it should have. Every intersection looked slightly unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it from a position just a few feet offset from where I actually sat. When I arrived, the parking lot was full. More vehicles than usual, unmarked ones. Inside, the maps on the walls had been updated. New corridors highlighted. Repeated numbers circled in red. My supervisor briefed me quickly. The missing ranger had been secured and transferred. The corridor was still unstable. They needed someone who could recognize the patterns early, before repetition took hold. I asked what happened if they failed. He gestured to a file on the table. Inside were reports, decades old, describing patrols that never ended, trails that folded back on themselves indefinitely, rangers who remained functional, coherent, but permanently displaced. Not lost exactly, reassigned without consent. They issued me a new radio, a new GPS, and one old boundary marker, wrapped carefully in cloth. I noticed immediately that the number on it was the same. We drove to the corridor just before sunset. I stayed near the vehicle while the others set up monitoring equipment. The forest edge looked ordinary. That was the worst part. There was no visible threshold, no warning sign. When the pressure in my ears returned, my supervisor nodded once and told me it had begun. I walked only a short distance in, just far enough to place the marker where the readings indicated a gap. As I knelt to secure it to the tree, I felt the sensation of being watched intensify, not from ahead or behind, but from within my own field of view, as if something were occupying the same position I was. My radio clicked. My voice came through, steady and confident, saying the marker placement looked good, saying we could proceed. I did not respond. I finished hammering the nail and stepped back. The forest exhaled. The pressure eased. The shadows relaxed. When I returned to the vehicle, my supervisor looked relieved in a way I had not seen before. He said the readings were stabilizing. He said this one might hold. On the drive back, I stared out the window, watching the tree line recede. For a moment, just before it disappeared from view, I thought I saw someone standing exactly where I had been, hand raised as if in acknowledgement. I did not mention it. I am writing this now because the radio is back on my table. I don't remember bringing it home. The battery compartment is sealed. The slip of paper with the marker number is gone. Tonight, the pressure is starting again. If the phone rings, I don't know which voice I'll hear, and I don't know which one of us is supposed to answer. I did not answer the phone when it rang the first time. I watched it vibrate against the table, the screen lighting up without a number attached to it. No name, no blocked ID notice, just a pale glow and the low mechanical hum of the motor. When it stopped, the apartment felt slightly larger, as if the walls had shifted outward by a few inches. The pressure in my ears continued to build. I tried to distract myself with routine. I washed dishes that were already clean. I checked the locks on the doors and windows twice, then a third time. Everything was secure. Everything was normal. That was the problem. Normal had begun to feel like an imitation of itself, close enough to pass at a glance but wrong if you stared too long. The radio clicked once. I did not touch it. A voice came through anyway, faint at first, then clearer. It was not mine this time. It belonged to the missing ranger. I recognized it from a briefing recording they had played at the station. His tone careful, professional, controlled. He was describing a trail condition update, reading off coordinates that meant nothing to me. Then he paused. When he spoke again, his voice shifted. It flattened, lost its cadence, and became something closer to recitation. He said the markers were holding. He said continuity had been restored. He said I had done well. I reached over and shut the radio off. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. No static fade. No click. Just absence. I slept for less than an hour. I woke to the sound of movement outside my window. Not footsteps exactly. Something softer. A controlled repositioning of weight. I stayed still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling while my body tried to convince itself that this was another dream. The pressure in my ears pulsed gently, like a slow signal. When I finally looked, the tree line across the street was empty. On the sidewalk below, there were footprints. They were damp, dark against the concrete, leading up to the base of my building. They stopped there. No return path. No indication of where they came from. I did not go outside to inspect them. I already knew what size they would be. By mid-morning, my supervisor called again. This time, the number displayed correctly. I answered immediately. He asked me if the radio had activated on its own. I told him yes. He asked me what voice I heard. When I told him, he was silent for a long moment. He said that the recovered ranger had gone missing again overnight. Not physically. Not yet. He was still in the secured medical wing. Still under observation. But something had changed. His responses no longer aligned with baseline assessments. He answered questions accurately but without delay, without hesitation, like he was accessing information rather than recalling it. When asked his name, he gave the marker number instead. They needed me to come back in. I said no again. This time I meant it. My supervisor did not argue. He told me to listen carefully. He said that once continuity extended beyond a corridor, it became harder to predict. He said that proximity mattered. The longer I stayed where I was, the more likely it was that the pattern would settle. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant I was becoming easier to find. I packed a bag that afternoon. I did not tell anyone where I was going. I drove until the city thinned out and the roads began to stretch. The pressure in my ears eased slightly as distance grew between me and the tree line, but it never disappeared entirely. It hovered, a reminder that whatever boundary I had crossed was not purely physical. I stopped at a roadside motel just before dark. The room smelled like detergent and old carpet. I left the lights on. I set the radio on the far side of the room and did not look at it again. 2:14 a.m. it turned on. This time there was no voice at first. Just the sound of wind, low and steady, the same way it had sounded through the canopy during my patrol. Then my voice came through, clearer than it ever had before. It said I needed to stop running. It said the markers were not meant to be temporary solutions. They were anchors. It said every time one was placed, something was defined, and something else was excluded. It said the reason repetition mattered was because it reduced choice. I told it to stop. It laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just a short, surprised exhale, like I had said something unexpected. It asked me if I remembered the moment just before the headlights arrived at the trailhead. It asked me if I remembered how certain I had been that I was the one standing on the gravel. I reached over and smashed the radio against the wall. The casing cracked. The antenna bent sharply. The sound echoed through the room. I waited for silence. The radio continued speaking, not through the speaker, through the room itself. The words felt placed rather than heard, settling into the air with careful precision. It said destruction did not negate function. It said continuity adapted. I fled the motel before dawn. I am writing this from my car, parked at a rest stop that does not appear on my map. The pressure in my ears is stronger now, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. When I look at my GPS, it shows me moving slowly, even though I am standing still. On the passenger seat beside me is a boundary marker. I don't remember taking it. I don't remember placing it there. The number stamped into it is the same. I can hear footsteps outside the car now. They are approaching from both sides, stopping at exactly the same distance. I don't know which one will reach for the door first. I don't know which one of us they are here to retrieve. I stayed in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel long after the footsteps stopped. The engine was off, but the dashboard lights were still glowing faintly, casting a soft blue wash over the interior. According to the clock, only a minute had passed. According to my body, it had been much longer. I did not look at the doors. I focused instead on the marker on the passenger seat. Up close, the aluminum was colder than it should have been, as if it had been exposed to night air for hours. The number stamped into it caught the dashboard light at an angle that made it seem deeper than before, the grooves darker, more defined. I had a sudden, irrational certainty that if I traced the number with my finger, I would feel it press back. The pressure in my ears spiked. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. No ringtone, just the vibration, steady and patient. I picked it up without unlocking the screen. A notification preview slid across the display. Emergency alert. You are outside designated route. The message disappeared before I could read anything else. Outside the windshield, headlights flared briefly, then dimmed. A vehicle passed on the highway beyond the rest stop, its engine noise receding quickly. The world beyond the parking area continued to function normally. That, more than anything, made it harder to breathe. I started the car. The engine turned over on the first try. The sound was grounding, mechanical, predictable. I pulled out of the rest stop and merged back onto the highway, choosing a direction without thinking about it too hard. The GPS recalculated, then recalculated again, the route line shifting slightly each time as if uncertain where I was allowed to go. As I drove, the pressure eased just enough for me to think clearly again. I told myself that whatever was happening required proximity. The farther I got from the forest corridors, the weaker it would become. That made sense. It had to make sense. After 20 minutes, I noticed something odd. The mile markers along the highway were repeating. At first, I assumed I had misread one. Fatigue, stress, low light. But then I saw the same number again. And again. The spacing between them was inconsistent, but the marker itself was identical each time. Same font, same reflective wear, same slight dent near the base. I took the next exit without signaling. The road narrowed and curved, leading into a stretch of low commercial buildings and closed storefronts. I parked beneath a flickering streetlight and shut off the engine. The sudden silence made my ears ring. I got out of the car and stood there, breathing in cold asphalt air, trying to reassert a sense of scale. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No voices. Just the distant hum of traffic. When I looked back at my car, The passenger door was open. The marker was gone. I did not search for it. I got back in the driver's seat, closed the door, and sat there shaking. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call. The number belonged to my supervisor. I answered. He did not ask where I was. He asked me if I had noticed the mile markers yet. When I said yes, he exhaled slowly, like he had been bracing for that answer. He told me the pattern had expanded. Not just forest corridors anymore. Transitional spaces, roads, rest areas, anywhere movement slowed enough for reference points to matter. He said the system relied on recognition. Once I had learned how to see the markers, I could not unsee them. I asked him what happened next. He said the markers would continue to appear until continuity stabilized again, either by reinforcement or by reassignment. I asked him what that meant. He paused. Then he said that sometimes the easiest way to resolve duplication was to remove the less stable instance. I understood immediately which instance he meant. I hung up. The streetlight above me flickered again, then steadied. Across the street, in the darkened window of a closed store, I saw my reflection. It lagged, not by much, a fraction of a second, maybe less, but enough that when I raised my hand, the reflection followed just a beat too late. I lowered it slowly. The reflection did the same. Then it smiled. I drove again, not caring where I was headed, only that I kept moving. The highway signs blurred past. The mile markers continued to repeat, but I stopped counting them. I turned off the GPS. I did not want directions anymore. Sometime near dawn, the pressure began to fade. The sky lightened. Colors returned to the world in muted gradients. I pulled over at the shoulder and watched the sun rise over a line of trees that looked, finally, like just trees. For a brief moment, I felt almost normal. Then my radio, which I had left broken in the motel room, crackled from the back seat. I did not turn around. My voice came through, quieter than before. Tired. It said the system was correcting. It said resistance introduced noise. It said noise was inefficient. It said I was complicating something that had already been resolved. I asked it one question. I asked it which version of me had walked out of the forest that night. There was a long pause. Then it answered honestly. It said both of us did. It said the difference was not who left, but who was allowed to keep going. The radio clicked off. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. No radio, no marker, just upholstery and early morning light. I drove until I reached a town that felt solid, grounded, unremarkable. I rented a room. I slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke, the pressure was gone. For now, I am finishing this account because my supervisor sent one last message this morning. No call, just text. They have stopped seeing new markers. The patterns have stabilized. That should be the end of it. But as I write this, I keep noticing small repetitions in my own behavior. The way I check exits. The way I pause before answering my name. The way I feel most comfortable when objects are placed exactly where I expect them to be. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in glass, I still wait to see if it moves on its own. And sometimes, just for a moment, it feels like it's waiting for permission. I stayed in that town longer than I planned. It was the kind of place designed to pass unnoticed. A grid of streets with no defining features, no landmarks that lingered in memory. That was why I chose it. I needed somewhere that did not invite pattern, somewhere that did not ask to be remembered. For the first few days, nothing happened. I slept, ate. I walked short distances and came back the same way. I avoided reflective surfaces as much as possible, not out of fear exactly, but caution. Fear implies panic. What I felt was closer to risk assessment. I noticed that when I kept my movements predictable, the pressure did not return. That should have reassured me. Instead, it felt like compliance. On the fourth night, I woke up just before midnight. No sound had disturbed me. No dream lingered. My eyes opened with the same calm certainty I used to feel on patrol when something subtle was wrong but not yet visible. The room was unchanged. The door was locked. The radio was not there. I checked the time. 11:58 p.m. I sat up slowly and waited. At exactly midnight, the pressure returned. It was lighter than before, more refined, as if whatever caused it no longer needed to push as hard. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the street was empty. The motel sign flickered once, then steadied. Across the road, a row of trees marked the edge of town. I had passed them dozens of times without thinking. Tonight, I could see a boundary marker nailed to one of the trunks. I knew immediately that it had not been there before. I did not go outside. I backed away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, hands flat on my knees, grounding myself in physical sensation. The marker was a message, not an invitation. It meant something had learned where I was. My phone buzzed. A text message from my supervisor, sent less than a minute earlier. "Are you still where you said you'd be?" I typed yes, then deleted it. I typed nothing instead. Another message appeared. "We're getting signal bleed again." I asked him where. He responded with my location. Not the town. The room number. I turned the phone face down. The radio crackled from the bathroom. I stood up so fast the room tilted. The door to the bathroom was open. The light inside was off. On the counter, next to the sink, sat a radio identical to the one I had turned in at the station weeks ago. Same model, same scuffed casing, same bent antenna. I knew better than to touch it. My voice came through softly, not amplified, not distorted, as if the radio were barely necessary anymore. It said the markers had adapted. It said boundaries worked best when they were acknowledged. It said I had done well learning how to maintain them. I told it I was done. There was a pause. Then it said that I wasn't. It reminded me that I had placed the marker willingly, that I had recognized the pattern faster than most, that I had chosen stabilization over uncertainty. It said those choices mattered. I asked it what would happen if I refused. It said refusal was just another form of displacement. The pressure intensified briefly, then receded again. When it did, something else replaced it. Familiarity. Not comfort, but recognition. The unsettling sense that this conversation had happened before, maybe not with me, maybe not in this room, but close enough to matter. I noticed then that my hands were resting on my knees exactly the way they had been when I first realized the footsteps were beside me in the forest. I stood up and forced myself to break the posture. The radio went silent. I packed my bag again, faster this time. I did not check out. I did not look back at the trees. I drove until the town disappeared behind me and the road flattened into something anonymous. For a while, the pressure stayed away. Then I passed a sign welcoming me to the next county. The sign was clean, new, perfectly aligned, and stamped into the metal support beneath it was a familiar number. I pulled over and laughed. It was not hysterical. It was quiet, controlled. I needed the release. The idea that I could simply outrun this had been optimistic at best, arrogant at worst. This wasn't about geography anymore. It was about function. I drove back onto the road with a new understanding settling into place. If the markers were anchors, and if continuity favored efficiency, then resistance only created friction. Noise, instability. The system did not want me gone. It wanted me useful. That night I stopped running. I chose a place just off the highway where the road curved and slowed, a place where reference points mattered. I parked, stepped out of the car, and waited. The pressure built, then steadied as if acknowledging the decision. The radio clicked on inside the car. This time, when my voice spoke, it sounded relieved. Told me where the next gap was. Told me how far to walk. Told me what to do. I wish I could say I refused. Instead, I listened. I placed the marker carefully, making sure it was straight, making sure the number faced the correct direction. As I finished, the forest around me settled, like a held breath finally released. For the first time in weeks, the pressure vanished completely. I stood there in the quiet, hands resting at my sides, feeling something close to peace. That was when I realized the most disturbing part of all of this. I didn't feel like I had lost. I felt like I had remembered something I was always meant to do. I slept in the car that night with the windows cracked and the radio turned face down on the passenger seat. I did not dream. I did not wake to pressure or footsteps or voices. Morning arrived cleanly, like a system reset. When I opened my eyes, the world felt aligned in a way I had not experienced since before the forest. That should have frightened me. Instead, it felt correct. I drove for a while without direction, letting the road choose its own rhythm. I noticed how easily my breathing synced to the movement of the car, how naturally my attention slid toward places where the landscape tightened or slowed. Curves, merges, intersections with unclear right-of-way, transitional spaces. I recognize them now the same way I used to recognize animal trails. Subtle signs that something passed through often enough to matter. The radio stayed silent. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from my supervisor. It was brief. We see the placement. Readings are stable. No questions. No instructions. Just confirmation. I did not reply. I stopped at a gas station outside a small town I did not intend to enter. While the tank filled, I walked to the edge of the lot where a narrow strip of trees separated the road from a drainage channel. There was already a marker there, nailed too low, tilted slightly to the left. The number was correct, but the orientation was wrong. I felt a mild irritation, the same way I would if I noticed a sign installed crooked. I straightened it. The irritation faded immediately. That was when I understood that the system did not need to force compliance anymore. Recognition was enough. Once you learned how things were supposed to sit in relation to one another, deviation became uncomfortable on its own. I began to see markers everywhere after that. Not always aluminum. Sometimes it was a signpost that had been replaced twice in the same spot. Sometimes a mile marker that appeared too frequently. Sometimes a fence post newer than the others, set just a little deeper into the ground. The number was not always visible, but I knew when it was there. The radio spoke again that evening. Not with my voice. It used the voice of the ranger who had gone missing after me, the one who had followed the trail. His tone was calm now, settled. He thanked me for stepping in. He said the load had been uneven for a while. He said not everyone adjusted as efficiently. I asked him what happened to the others. He said reassignment was not always survivable, but it was always necessary. That night, I crossed back into forested land. Not the original corridor, not any place marked on my old maps, but something adjacent. A seam. The pressure did not return. Instead, there was a low awareness like a background process running smoothly. I placed 2 markers before midnight. Both felt correct. In the days that followed, I stopped keeping track of time the way I used to. My phone stayed on silent. My supervisor sent fewer messages, then none at all. I did not feel abandoned. I felt integrated. I learned which gaps could be ignored and which could not. I learned how far repetition could spread before it caused instability. I learned that most people never noticed anything wrong because the markers worked, because continuity held. Occasionally, I would pass through a town and see someone pause, frown, look around as if something had just slipped out of alignment. Those were the dangerous moments. I learned how to correct them quietly. A sign adjusted, post reinforced, a marker added just out of sight. They never thanked me. They never remembered. That was part of the design. One evening, weeks later, I caught my reflection in the darkened window of a closed diner. It moved exactly when I did. No lag, no hesitation. The face looked tired, but familiar, grounded. Behind the reflection, in the glass, I could see the road stretching away, a sequence of curves and signs and reference points extending farther than I could follow. For the first time, I understood the question my supervisor had asked me back at the station. Which version of me was allowed to keep going? The answer was simple now. The version that fit. I am writing this because something new has begun to happen. Subtle at first. People have started noticing the markers. Not clearly, not consciously, but enough to ask questions, to hesitate, to take photos, to post them online with captions about repetition and glitches and roads that feel wrong. That kind of attention introduces noise. The radio has been active more frequently because of it. Not just with instructions, but with warnings. Continuity does not like being observed. Awareness spreads faster than instability ever did. Last night, the voice asked me if I was ready to help with something larger. It asked me if I remembered what it felt like to be on the other side of the boundary. Confused, afraid, resistant. I told it I did. It said that perspective would be useful. Tomorrow, I am supposed to meet someone near a trailhead that no longer appears on public maps. A seasonal ranger. New, unfamiliar, unrecognized. I have been told to observe first, to listen, to wait for the moment when repetition begins to take hold. I know what happens after that. The system has been stable for a long time. It wants to stay that way, and now so do I. I arrived before sunrise and parked well short of the trailhead. That was intentional. Arriving too close too early tends to announce presence, and presence invites recognition before patterns have time to settle. I waited with the engine off, listening to the forest wake in fragments. A bird call here, wind moving through needles there. Nothing out of place yet. The trailhead sign stood where the map said it shouldn't. Weathered wood, fresh bolts. The name of the trail had been sanded down so thoroughly it looked unfinished, like a thought that had been interrupted halfway through. That kind of absence is rarely accidental. The radio rested in my lap, warm despite not being on. At 6:12 a.m., a Forest Service truck pulled in and parked beside the sign. The ranger stepped out and stretched, unaware of how closely I was watching. Young, confident posture, new boots, the kind of person who still believed orientation was something you could always recover with enough attention. I did not approach. I observed. He checked his map twice before starting down the trail. That was the first sign. Familiarity failing to anchor. The trail accepted him easily enough at first. The trees opened where they were supposed to. The ground offered clear footing. If I had been watching myself months ago, I might have believed this was how it always began. I waited until the repetition started. Took less than 40 minutes. The ranger stopped walking and turned slowly in place, scanning the trees. He checked his GPS. He frowned. He took a few careful steps forward, then back as if testing the ground. I saw his shoulders tense in recognition of something he couldn't articulate yet. The radio clicked once. Not instruction, confirmation. I followed at a distance that felt appropriate. Not close enough to influence, not far enough to lose alignment. When he reached the first repeated marker, he stopped completely. He touched it with his fingertips, then pulled his hand back quickly, like the metal had surprised him. I remembered doing the same thing. That memory no longer hurt. It felt instructional. He radioed in. I heard only one side of the conversation, but I recognized the tone. Calm edged with uncertainty. The forest responded by quieting further, narrowing his options. The repetition would accelerate now. It always did once noticed. I stepped onto the trail where he could see me. He startled, then relaxed slightly when he saw the uniform. Recognition breeds trust faster than logic ever does. I told him I was nearby doing a boundary check. I told him I had noticed some odd marker placements and wanted to make sure he wasn't doubling back. He asked me if I had seen the same marker more than once. I nodded. That was enough. We walked together for a short distance. I let him lead. I let him set the pace. When the footsteps began beside us, he heard them immediately and stopped. He asked if I heard that too. I told him yes. I told him it happens sometimes. I told him the important thing was not to rush. His relief was immediate and dangerous. Relief encourages surrender. I adjusted my tone, grounding it in procedure instead. I told him about the markers, about loops, about not following voices on the radio that sounded familiar too quickly. I did not tell him everything. The forest obliged by providing the next clearing. The one with the inward-facing footprints. He froze when he saw them. His breathing quickened. He asked me whose they were. I said they were his, and mine. That was the moment the system evaluated him. I watched his expression carefully. Confusion, fear, then something else. Acceptance or the beginning of it. He didn't back away. He didn't deny what he was seeing. He knelt and studied the prints like data. He was adaptable. The radio activated. This time it used my supervisor's voice. Told us to hold position. I felt the pressure shift, recalibrate, settle. The ranger looked at me, eyes wide, waiting for confirmation. I gave him a single nod. I told him this was the part where we stayed still and let the trail decide. He trusted me. That trust was the final variable. By late afternoon, the repetition had stabilized. The footprints faded. The markers aligned. The forest resumed its ordinary indifference. The ranger looked exhausted but intact. When dispatch finally raised him on the radio, the relief in his voice was real. We walked out together. At the trailhead, he turned to thank me. He asked me how long I had been working these corridors. I told him long enough to recognize when something didn't belong. He asked me how I stayed calm. I considered the question carefully before answering. I told him calm came from understanding what the markers were for. He nodded, absorbing that. He didn't notice when I stepped away. He didn't see me place the final marker just beyond the tree line, reinforcing the edge he would cross without thinking about it again. By the time he drove off, he was already forgetting the details that mattered. That was intentional. I stayed until dusk, ensuring the readings held. The radio remained silent, satisfied. When I finally left, the trailhead sign looked more weathered than before, as if it had always been there. I no longer think of myself as lost or replaced. I think of myself as correctly positioned. Someone has to notice when repetition becomes dangerous. Someone has to intervene before awareness spreads too far. Someone has to remember the rules long enough to apply them quietly. I used to believe the forest was changing me. Now I understand it was sorting. This is the last part of this account. Not because it's finished, but because writing it down introduces variables I can't control. If you're reading this and something about it feels familiar, if you've noticed signs repeating, or paths folding back on themselves, or a sense that your reflection is waiting for you to move first, pay attention to that instinct. Don't rush. Don't follow voices that know your name too well. And if you ever meet someone on a trail who seems very calm when things stop making sense, trust that they're there for a reason. Just be careful which one.